right, let me just pour myself a stiff drink. A stiff drink of tap water. And we'll begin. So I was debating this. I might still do a couple of different videos on this topic at some point. But I think for the moment, this might just be how I'm going to deal with it, is to do a live stream on it. And I decided to do a live stream because I think it gives an opportunity if people maybe want to correct if I have some historical inaccuracies or stuff like that. If there's like some historical inaccuracies or people want to add in some additional uh, context or some examples that I maybe missed. If not, I might still do some videos on it. I just frankly kind of too lazy to do them today, but it is what it is. So let's see here. Yeah, so the book is by a member of the tribe and like a neocon Israeli guy. That doesn't. Oh no, he's not Israeli. Of course, he's not actually Israeli. Like most of the most fervent Israeli nationalists, he's an American neocon. But that doesn't mean his writing is inaccurate, and it doesn't mean that it's like that the historical aspects of it are inaccurate or his analysis is flawed. So I'll be honest. I'm not completely through the book yet, but I kind of wanted to talk about the parts that I've been through. Not so much about maybe the book itself, but just because I think it raises a lot of interesting looks at military strategy. Take a sip. Okay, so the book in question is what's it called again? Armies of Sand. So it takes a look at the past, present, and future of Arab armies. And he goes through a bunch of different. Why is this not showing up? Is DuckDuckGo just shit or something? I don't know. Um, but yeah, so he takes a look at, well, the past, present, and future of Arab armies from 1948 to the present. I'm not sure if he's going to talk about why ISIS was effective. He does talk about why the Iraqi army was ineffective against ISIS, but why is this not showing up? Let me see here. Oh, okay. It doesn't have a. There isn't a actual page for it on Wikipedia. There's just one for Kenneth M. Pollack, a former CIA analyst and member of APAC. But yeah, so he's attempting to look up. Um, he's attempting to figure out why it is that Arab militaries basically have fared so bad in every single conflict they've been in, from the Toyota War to the Iran Iraq War to the numerous wars against Israel. It's always been a complete and total shit show, and they've massively underperformed. And like the cope that Arab countries try to have is, oh, it's the Americans gave Israel all this like advanced equipment and advanced equipment and advanced weaponry and that kind of thing, and that's the reason we lost. It wasn't because of our incompetence. It wasn't because we did stupid things. It's because the Israelis were so had gotten so much shit from America. And that's not the truth, really, at all. Um, it took a while for American aid to really make a huge difference. And it's not as if the Arab armies didn't receive good quality weaponry. Like, let's take a look at the Six Day War. The Egyptian and other Arab armies actually, in a lot of cases, had better equipment than the Israelis did. They had more of it and better made equipment. It's like it's not as if I don't know if there's like a meme or something, but are we really supposed to accept that like Soviet made tanks are like bad? Maybe they're not quite as good as some Western models in terms of aspects of technology, but um, like they're not like bad. Soviet, let's see here, armies and weapons. So Arab armies had. Let me see. When was the T-55 introduced? Um, okay, so that's a post World War II tank. Although they kept upgrading it. Um, so if we look at like the distribution of forces, the Israelis during the Six Day War were using Super Shermans, which is, I believe, a World War II. I think it's an upgunned version of the Sherman. I'm not sure if they put more armor on it, but it's literally just like a World War II tank that they put a bigger gun on. There's the Patton, which is a 1950s tank. And we have the Centurion, which is another 1940-50s tank. And if we look at like what the Arabs had, let's see here, T-55s, T-54s. From my understanding, we're all quite capable, um, or at least we're okay. It's not as if like it's bad. My understanding is their artillery was actually better. Let me just take a look at the. Okay, so they had aircraft from like the 1950s to 1960s. So it's not as if they were particularly bad aircraft. The Israelis had Dassaults versus, or is it Dassault? It had Dassaults as opposed to. Let me just see if I can change this. Um, MiGs, but once again, they don't look like they were particularly worse off than they were prior to it. Also, the Arab troops had AK-47s versus FAL. So I know this is kind of maybe a bit of a side point, but the point is the whole like Israeli technological superiority thing wasn't really that big a deal until much more recently. The Arabs tended to have comparable, if not better, technology at their disposal. They also just had a lot more of it. So, like, let's take a look at the. Let's see. Does it have the total numbers here? I'm just trying to see if they have a total. Okay, so the Israelis had 800 tanks versus 2,500 for the Arabs. The Arabs had 3 to 4 times as many combat aircraft. Um, they had twice the number of troops, and it was just a disaster. So my point is just looking at the lay of the land, looking at the size of the forces that we have. It's not as if the Arabs were at an inherent technological disadvantage. We're not facing a scenario here like what you saw with the Zulus versus the British, for instance, where the Zulus were competent in their own way and they did win at Isalawana, but they ultimately were just kind of couldn't do anything because they didn't have like cartridge rifles, which the British did. If we look at like the Yom Kippur War, once again the Arabs had equal, if not more. Oh wait, that's Egypt. Okay, so total the Arabs had twice as many tanks, um, similar number of aircraft. I think they had more armor and that sort of thing. So the question is, why do they suck so hard? Like if you look at the casualties, okay, so the Israelis lost 400 tanks. Actually, I'm not really sure how many they lost. The Arabs lost 10 times as many aircraft, like 10 times, no, like 20 times as many soldiers. It was a complete and total disaster, despite it really not, it shouldn't have been one at all. Let me just go because I think the worst defeat actually was not that. The worst one I think was Lebanon. Let me just find where Lebanon was. First Lebanese War. Where Syria lost. Does it have here? Yeah. So during the Lebanese War, the Syrians lost like 85 aircraft. The Israelis, I think, lost one due to mechanical breakdown. The Syrians didn't shoot down a single aircraft, and they lost like 400 tanks. So I'm just kind of giving context to this. So, in the light of this, the question is, how could they just suck so bad? Um, why did it keep going so poorly? So the author's goal is to try to figure out why is this the case. So he posits four possible reasons that are commonly given, which are reliance on Soviet military doctrine, politicization of the armed forces, uh, underdevelopment of the relative underdevelopment of Arab countries, technologically, socially, and economically, and cultural factors. And I've read the first three parts of it. So the first thing he talks about, and that's kind of what the title of this stream comes from, is the whole Soviet military strategy thing. So this is a common one that Americans like to say because they hate the Soviet Union and they want to minimize them. So the claim is because the Arabs used technology, um, Soviet technology, Soviet trainers, that kind of thing, and they theoretically were made like Arab translations of Soviet military models. But that's the problem. They were just doing what those like stupid Russians were doing. Because the Russians had a very different way of looking at warfare than the Americans did. So, from my understanding, in warfare, there's two broad approaches. And these are just ideals. They don't. Obviously, there's a mix of them in real life. Um, During real life. Oh, yeah. So there's a strategic or operational focus and a tactical focus. So I would say that um, with regards to a strategic focus or an operational focus, there is an overall goal for the campaign, and the actual casualties are secondary. Winning individual battles is secondary or even irrelevant. The ultimate goal of the operation comes first, and everything else is kind of secondary. That's not to say there isn't tactical flexibility or changing the plan on a fly or that kind of thing, But if there's a choice between winning a minor engagement and succeeding on an operational level, the goal is to succeed on the operational level. So, like, maybe one of the best examples of this is Operation Migration. Would be something like Operation Migration during World War II, where the Germans lost. So this was the Soviet Union's big defense offensive that destroyed Army Group Center, retook Belarus and lots of eastern Poland. Now the Soviets lost significantly more soldiers during this, like 1.5 as many. Although this isn't as bad as a lot of various offensives, but it achieved its goal. It completely destroyed Army Group Center. It retook a shit ton of territory. It was more or less a disaster for them. From my understanding, Kursk was also something like that, where the Russians, if you just look at it purely in terms of manpower, the Russians lost like 10 times as many tanks as the Germans, but at the end of the day, they were left in possession of the battlefield, from my understanding, and the Germans weren't able to recover their tanks, and they had succeeded in destroying the German operational the initiative. So you have stuff like that. And what that tends to lend itself to is, if we're going to use Hearts of Iron terms, a grand battle plan doctrine. So the goal there is you have a big plan that's very detailed. The different phases of it are planned beforehand. You'll often get your troops to rehearse it a number of times. Everybody knows what they're doing. And you can deviate from it a bit, but there's the operational goal. And doing that is the priority. Another example of this is what Hitler's original plan was for Operation Barbarossa, which was, we have to take the oil in the Caucasus and the food in the Ukraine. And destroying the Russian army is nice, but that's not the primary goal. If we take the food and the oil, the Russian economy will collapse and they'll have to come to favorable terms, or just that the Red Army will lose all effectiveness. And it largely failed because the general staff didn't understand this, because they were thinking in a much more tactical fashion. And their goal was to try to kill Russians, get favorable kill ratios, destroy the Red Army. And that's why you get ideas like, we have to go to Moscow. If there was like a choice for the general staff between making it closer to the Caucasus and the food, or killing Red Army soldiers, they would always pick the latter. And to that end, it just meant that they weren't really able to achieve the goal, because I think Hitler realized they were never going to be able to beat the Soviet army in attritional warfare. And like, you can even see this towards the end of the war, where after Stalingrad failed, Hitler said, okay, well, the next goal is, we're kind of fucked, but if we can hang on to the Ukraine and Myakop, then maybe we can still starve them out. If we could just hang on. And the general staff didn't get that. And they're like, you have to withdraw back so we can improve our supply lines and stuff like that. And you kind of had a similar issue, because German military doctrine, from my understanding, tends to emphasize individual initiative of commanders. It's German officers are supposed to be flexible. They're supposed to take initiative. If they see an opportunity, they're supposed to exploit it. And they kind of, to a certain extent, just have this is a massive oversimplification, but carte blanche to do what's necessary in combat. And this generally means that if you look at the Germans versus any the Russians or the Americans or whatever, or maybe not the Americans as much, but the Germans normally deal more damage to their opponents. But it also means that their strategic offensives often don't work. Like, I feel in World War one of the big problems with Operation Michael or the Spring Offensive was there was no objective. It was just a massive offensive, and commanders were just kind of picking and choosing what they were going to do um, on a daily basis in response to the situation. So by the end of it, they did more damage to the Allies, but it didn't really strategically help their position at all. And they had burned through all of their remaining reserves and were basically incapable of launching further offensives after that point. Now, I would argue, on the other hand, sometimes you get the other issue, um, where it does work. Like, I would argue to a certain extent, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, the Germans in World War One were just trying to destroy Russian armies mostly on the Eastern Front because technology was at a point there where it was kind of hard for them to drive like all the way into Russia far enough to launch a knockout blow. But because they were able to keep destroying Russian field armies and make the Shah look really bad, it destabilized the regime a great deal. One of the issues I think that happened at Verdun was mission creep, where the original goal was just it was just to destroy the what was I thinking of? To just cause attrition to the French army, but they kind of changed course with what they were trying to do, and instead of doing that, they tried to actively take Verdun. Could someone maybe in the chat, if you can think of one, post some other examples of where a focus on tactical victories, kill ratios, or that sort of thing led to victory in a war? Because I could be wrong, but I think that's worked in other cases. Um, but yeah. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to take a slight sidestep. So the Soviet way of war was very much focused on operational objectives, planning, and that sort of thing. But the Soviet doctrine was extremely aggressive and was very, very much focused on firepower, particularly armored firepower. Soviet units had a lot of tanks in them. Specifically, they had a lot of armored personnel characters and stuff like that. Um, it worked in COD Deathmatch. Okay, I don't think that's a real world war. Um, but yeah, so there's a focus on firepower, combined arms, being very aggressive, and always keeping the initiative. It combined with good planning, and I mean, you can't really argue it worked pretty well once they fully adopted it in World War II. There's nothing wrong with having planned attacks. I mean, the Brusilov offensive did well, Vimy Ridge did well. Um, I think the British had used that to success in Africa. Okay, so someone puts Napoleon relied a lot on tactical prowess, defeat, and detail throughout his various campaigns. Yeah, that's true. Napoleon's strategic objectives tended to focus on destroying the opposing army rather than necessarily capturing strategically important territory. But once again, and we'll get into this later, the nature of war has changed a lot over time, and the Arabs are just really bad at dealing with these kind of things, dealing with kind of the changes in warfare that came about. So in the book, what he tends to do is he tends to take a couple examples of where the Arabs tried to do this and then when other people tried to do this, and to kind of contrast. So the examples he gives of when non-Arab countries used Soviet military doctrine was the Cubans in Angola and the North Koreans during the Korean War. So the North Koreans actually did really well during the first phase of the Korean War. Let me just look that up. They, I think, basically destroyed South Korea's army. Let me just go down and look at the North Korean offensive. Let's see here. Like, I think the North Koreans more or less just completely smashed through the South Korean formations. Let me see here. I forget if they took Seoul or not. Um, yeah, North Korea took Seoul. Um, North Korea did a very good job with combined arms, with being aggressive, with being creative. The soldiers fought consistently well. They were able to use modern equipment properly, a lot of that kind of thing. So the guy tries to kind of somewhat undermine this by saying, oh, that the North Korean offensive was primarily planned by Soviet generals, but they were able to execute it properly. And they were able, if there was any kind of change or trouble, to adapt to the situation. And I mean, it failed, but it didn't really fail because of their incompetence or their poor strategic planning or the performance of their soldiers. America just came in with overwhelming force and basically counter destroyed them. But the Republic of Korea Army, to my understanding, got completely trounced in the first phase of the war. So the Soviets, no, sorry, the North Koreans. So that didn't really work out. But once again, it wasn't anything really to do with Soviet doctrine or any of that kind of thing. But I mean, they lost, but it wasn't the Soviet way of war that was a problem. If anything, it actually worked pretty well. The other example he gives was the Koreans in Angola, where the Koreans, sorry, not the Koreans, the Cubans. You can say what you will about the Cubans. They are very good soldiers. The Cubans are the South African Defense Force, who was fighting the Cubans in Angola, described them as being personally brave to the point of being almost foolhardy. Like, the Cubans wouldn't break, they were extremely aggressive, they were very creative. I think how it generally worked during the Angolan War is the MPLA would provide the infantry and the Cubans would provide the air support, the tanks, the artillery, that kind of thing. Which actually worked pretty well because Africans are actually pretty good at fighting as infantry or motorized infantry, much better than Arabs, because they're able to be very aggressive. They're able to be aggressive, they're able to scout, they're able to um, do sneak attacks and ambushes. They're able to do envelopment and force concentration and that kind of thing. So the Angolan, let me just see here, South Africa. Um, or is it Border War? I think it was called the Border War. Yeah, South African Border War. So I think it wound up being something like a draw in terms of how well the conflict worked. South Africa had to withdraw from uh, Angola, but I don't think they really lost any territory in Namibia. Let's see here. Or maybe they did abandon Namibia. I'm not sure. The whole thing went on for a long time, and there was a number of different offensives. But generally speaking, they were able to use Soviet strategies, Soviet weaponry, stuff like that very well. And it tended to be a bit of a toss up whenever you had battles between the Cubans and the South Africans. So let me just see if there's a couple maybe battles here that we can take a peek at. We don't have known losses there. There's one where the Cubans won. I'm just trying to see if there was a larger battle that we can take a look at. But the Angolans weren't actually that bad. And this is what happened during the Chad War, which we'll get to in a bit. But the Angolans, I think, understood what their strengths were and what their weaknesses were, and they just played to their strengths. And that, generally speaking, worked out. Actually, what's interesting during the Angolan War is that Fidel Castro took over direct command of it, which he ran from Havana. And the war he actually did a really good job at planning the war. The Cubans, generally speaking, whenever there was a war the Soviets wanted to intervene in, but they didn't want to be directly involved in, they'd send in the Cubans. Like they did that in Ethiopia, and there was a couple other places in Africa that the Cubans intervened in. But yeah, so he's like, basically his point is, okay, so these guys were able to do it. It's not as if like Soviet tactics didn't work in either of these occasions. So why did the Arabs suck so hard? And a big issue that Arab armies have, and you see this consistently throughout the book, is they're extremely passive. What seems to happen is the extent of what they're able to do is maneuver or into a position, dig in, and then not counterattack, not reposition forces, but just sit there and not really do anything until they get wiped out. And there's no ability to react to any sort of change in the situation. There's no ability to take any kind of individual initiative or that kind of thing. And the issue isn't really like the overall strategic plan, because he goes through this. It's kind of interesting because the Arabs started out with really bad generals, but that was something they really were able to professionalize as time went on. So like the general staff of Egypt went from being like abysmal in 67 to being much better in 73. Similarly, the Iraqi general staff went from being horrible when they started the Iranian-Iraq war, but was really good by the end of it. However, it didn't matter because the people in general were not able to carry out any of the plans. Like they could come up with the best, most brilliant plans. They could come up with very simple, logical, easy to carry out plans, but the armies were just completely incapable of doing it. The best they could do, and the couple times Arabs actually won, was so like what happened in 73 during the Yom Kippur War, although he insists on calling it the October War. But so during the Yom Kippur War, the Egyptians managed to cross the Suez Canal and take a decent amount of Sinai Peninsula. So there was a couple different reasons of that. Partially it was a surprise attack, but the Egyptians had spent the last like 3 years rehearsing constantly the amphibious landings. They had some military units perform the plan hundreds of times so that they could do it in their sleep. And that was, they had success because they were able to cross the Suez Canal and take some area which was mostly undefended by the Israelis. And then the Israelis counterattacked and completely destroyed them. And they weren't able to like even really shoot back. And then they just retreated back across the Suez Canal. And the Israelis were going to start invading Egypt, but the Americans and Soviets managed to broker a ceasefire. And then during the Iran-Iraq War, by the end of the war, the Iraqi General Staff literally just wrote these extremely detailed plans because they just were like, we can't. I think they made like flow charts where it's like, if the enemy does this, do this. Because the field officers were so bad, they couldn't like do anything. Like Arab armies are so incompetent. A frequent thing you see in these books. So one of the big advantages America had during World War II, and that the Soviets had after World War II, is American artillery was extremely. What's the thumbnail for this? I actually have no idea what it even is. Let me see here. Oh, it's the Die Hard one. Okay, well, that's fine. That's funny. Um, yeah, so all artillery fire had to be pre-planned. So they literally, if the Arab armies wanted to use artillery, they had to have it set up like 3 or 4 days in advance to fire at a specific area. And if the enemy moved, they weren't able to reposition their artillery and fire at a different area. If you've ever seen We Were Soldiers or Band of Brothers, you'll find that the Americans had really, really good fire control. So you'll see them basically call in artillery very close to their position, and the artillery will rapidly come in, and the it would come in and just destroy what was ever in front of them. And they were able to do it relatively close to the American front lines without hitting the Americans too much. And that was just a massive advantage. And the Arabs just weren't able to do that. Like during the Iran Iraq War, I think there was a case where they just bombarded the same spot for like 3 days straight, and the Iranians just walked around it and attacked them. And they were just that inept. And like there would be times where they'd have like a 5 or 6 to 1 advantage in artillery, but they weren't able to like point them at the enemy. Um, if they were attacked from like the side or something like that, they weren't able to shift their artillery or defenses to the other side they were attacked in. Basically, all that they were able to do was just move to a location, dig in, and wait to get destroyed by whoever they went up against. And you kind of get this passivity in a lot of. Probably the worst example is how Arab armies tend to handle air power. So I think part of Soviet doctrine is there's a fair amount of guidance they get from ground control. It really helps them out and guides them as to where they're going, and I think points out stuff like enemy fighters and gives them advice. They weren't able to fly without that. So, like in 1982, the Israelis just jammed it. So the Syrian Air Force just flew into the like the battlefield, caught like over and over again, and they didn't maneuver. They didn't even know how to use the radar on their aircraft. So they didn't even turn it on. So they didn't even know where the Israelis were coming from. So they just got shot out of the sky, and they just kept sending more and more planes in that did basically nothing, and they just got shot out of the sky like one after another. The pilots couldn't dogfight. They weren't able to make any like independent decisions or anything like that. The performance was just literally that poor. Um, which brings us. My point is, they didn't use Soviet doctrine because Soviet doctrine is like your offensive. The Soviets placed a lot of focus on combined arms. You get the artillery, you get the air support, you get the helicopters, you get the infantry. Another issue that the Arabs frequently had. So early in World War II, the Soviets hadn't really gotten the concept of combined arms. So what they would often do is just send in tanks on their own, and tanks get completely destroyed by infantry without infantry support. I think it's something that a lot of people really don't understand. But anti tank weapons used by infantry are very effective, at least against tanks of the time period. And the infantry can like hide and wait or hide like and ambush them. So while tanks are immensely powerful and they have big guns and they have machine guns and they're immune to small arms fire, they really need infantry to go behind them to prevent enemy infantry from destroying them. And if you can get some artillery in and some air power in, you can just really rapidly blow through everything in your path. And they didn't do that. They just sent in tanks against the Israelis, generally by themselves, and then the Israeli infantry would just destroy them. Um, One of the major reasons you have tanks is that they're mobile. You try to uncover um, where your enemy is weak, or you launch a counterattack or something like that. But they just weren't able to do that under basically any circumstances. And maybe let's let this bring us to the Iran-Iraq War, which was one of the most like lol, or I don't know if you want to call it lollish, but just sheer examples of retardation I've ever seen. So one of the things that happened during the Iran-Iraq War is the Iraqis were really like impressed. So during the 6 Day War, the Israeli Air Force basically destroyed the entire Jordanian, Syrian, and Egyptian Air Force in the span of like the first 2 days, and the Israelis had complete air superiority. So the Iraqis were like, "That's a really good idea. We should try to do that." Let me see if they have it here. Um, oh no, that's Operation Revenge. I'm trying to find the airstrike. Um, okay, Iran-Iraq War, pre-war incidents. Sorry, let me just see here. It doesn't look like they have it listed as a specific battle. Okay, yeah, here we go. So the Iraqi Air Force um, launched a massive attack. I think they used like hundreds of planes and hundreds of sorties to attack the Iranian Air Force. Uh, and they destroyed, I think it was 2 planes. Iranians report that they couldn't tell what the intended targets were in a number of cases because they were so bad at hitting anything. It was a complete and total just shit show. I think they lost more planes than the Iranians did, and it like cost them air superiority early on in the war. Was like how bad they did it. They give an interesting example. So they were given orders, or they were given targets as to what they were supposed to attack. And if they saw like a bunch of Iranian planes sitting out on a runway, they didn't think, oh, we should hit those planes that are just sitting there. One of the big issues that you had during the course of the war, or during every Arab war, was that the Iranians were not able to. So they have really poor aim, like they can't hit anything. Like during the Lebanese war, the Syrian commandos would literally ambush Israeli armored columns from behind rocks on a hill in at close range, and they wouldn't be able to hit Israeli tanks with their anti-tank weapons. And their tanks can't hit like anything. Their aircraft can't hit anything. It's just such a shit show. So it did no damage to the Iranian Air Force. The Iranian Air Force was actually fairly competent despite being much smaller and having much less firepower. So, yeah, if we look at the force at the outset of the war, now this is another cope thing that I think Iraq has, where the cope is, oh, well, Iran's a bigger country, so Iran had a bigger army than us. And that's not actually true. The Iraqis had a bigger army, I think, at every point during the war. So if we look at the disposition of forces, at the outset of the war, the Iranian army was about 150,000 versus 200,000. The Iraqis had 2,800 tanks, whereas the Iranians had 500 tanks. The Iraqis had 4,000 APCs versus 1,000 for Iran. They had twice the number of fighters, and they were all operable. Um, they had, I think that's 4 times as much artillery, and they weren't able to win, despite having a massive quantitative and qualitative advantage. The Iranians, I remember it was listed that it was so bad that the Iraqis, literally, when they were invading Khuzestan, was they rolled in, they took a specific position, they didn't even bother to take any of the cities behind them or garrison anything, and the Iranians literally just walked in behind them and surrounded them. So it was just it was just that bad. Uh, Also, Iraq had basically everybody on Earth backing them. I think because they had both the Soviet Union and America backing them. Uh, the only people who I think supported Iran were Syria, Pakistan. Yeah, just like virtually no one. I think that China was the only significant one who supported them. But that, like, the Iraqis just couldn't do it. And if you look at, like, the advantage grew over time as the war went on. Why is Iran better? I actually don't know. He hasn't really gone into any detail about that. But if you look at like 1982, I guess the Iranians had an advantage at that point in the war. Although once again, I would say that this is probably misleading because I'm sure the Iraqi stuff was a lot better in terms of quality. But if you look how it is at the end of the war, the advantage is like 8 or 10 is like 10 to 1 on most metrics, and the Iraqis barely irked out a narrow victory by the end of it. If you could call it a victory, I mean, I don't really know. Uh, which one that you can say. I'd say it was an Iranian victory because the goal of the war was Iraq to invade and take a piece of Iranian territory, and they weren't able to actually take any of Iranian territory. And Iran did well despite the fact that they were at a massive disadvantage in terms of material. But yeah, the Iraqi army was just a fucking like disaster. And towards the end of the war, the Iraqis were barely like holding the Iranians back. They had to basically spend months planning like every single moment of their counteroffensives, and their counteroffensives only lasted like for I think 48 hours. So let's just maybe take a bit of a peek at these. Oh no, that was an Iranian victory. Let me see here. They don't seem to have any of the specific battles. Um, I think this was it. Yeah, this was the final one. This was the one they planned for like months in advance. Um, okay, so the actual offenses, most of them I think only lasted a couple of days each, but they were able to somehow win despite having more than 10 times the number of uh, aircraft and tanks. So so that was just a complete and total shit show. Um, and there was no excuse for Iraq doing nearly as bad as they like. There's no excuse. Like they should have just curb stomped Iran. Like they should have even been able to just like even overthrow the Ayatollahs, given how much of an advantage they had throughout the entirety of the war. The Persian Gulf War he talks about was another instance of retardation. Like the Iraqis could have done something. Basically, what the Iraqis did is they just occupied Kuwait against no resistance. They dug in and they just kind of sat there and let the Americans and coalition forces blow them up. They didn't try to do counteroffensives. They didn't try to invade Saudi Arabia or they had a lot of like artillery and stuff. They were just completely incapable of doing anything. A lot of their tanks didn't even have the um, a lot of tanks didn't even have proper shells. They had like training rounds or stuff like that. Let me just take a look at the Gulf War. Like the Iraqis should have been able to do something. They just said that the Iraqis just more or less sat there and waited to get killed. Um, like the Iraqis had thousands of tanks, artillery, SAM sites, stuff like that, but they weren't even really able to fire back at the Americans. Like in terms of just how horrendous the casualties were. The only slight victory they had was towards the end of the war. The Republican Guard just threw themselves at the um, the Americans long enough for the rest of the army to escape. Yeah, like let's look at some of the battles. I get that the Americans had an advantage, but you'd think by like randomly firing, they would have been able to get more kills. Like if all their tanks just fired all their ammunition at the Americans, you would have thought they would have been able to do better than what they did. So let's see here. Iraqi tactical victory. What the fuck was this? Um, I know. I'm trying to find like a good example of what I'm talking about. Okay, those are just some random uh, battles in the Persian Gulf. Those aren't very interesting. Air campaign. Let's just go through some of these. Air engagements of the Gulf War. Let's see here. Yeah, it was 10-1. I feel like it should be higher than that, though. What was this? I'm just trying to find one of these. Battle of 73 Easting. Okay, so yeah, like look at this 4,000 versus 3,500. The Iraqis had 400 armored vehicles. The Americans lost one armored vehicle versus like 360 for the Iraqis. Like you'd think if all the Iraqi artillery was just firing indiscriminately, they would have been able to do at least something, but they just couldn't. Like it's I don't think their equipment was even that bad. Um yeah, here we go. 73 East. Oh no, that was we looked at that one already. No casualties versus the entire battalion destroyed. Uh, no, yeah, yeah. Ruru points out in the chat the Iraqis didn't have any airborne command and control assets, and their ground radar stations were BTFO'd by anti-radiation missiles. Yeah, the Arabs didn't really know how to even use the aircraft on their sorry, the radar on their aircraft. Let me see here. Battle of Medina Ridge. Oh no, four tanks destroyed or damaged versus like 200 tanks. Because so the Iraqis basically just dug in and waited to get slaughtered. Like once again, if they had have just driven at the Americans, expending their munitions, you'd think that would have worked better. Like anything would have been. I don't see how you could have had worse military performance. Then I don't know how it's even like possible to have worse military performance than the Iraqis during Desert Storm. Like another thing might have been, and Serb suggested this, to invade Saudi Arabia and try to attack the coalition forces as they're gathering. And I mean, who knows if that would have worked or not, but it would have worked better than what happened, um, which was a failure in every conceivable level. Um, so once again, like there's no excuse for being as bad as it is. And this brings us to the most meme. Okay, so Ruru points out they had MiG 25s and Mirage F1s, which were top of the line Soviet aircraft at the time, that were of similar quality. Okay, that's true. That's definitely is the case. What am I looking at? Okay. So we're gonna get to the meme part. I'm just actually gonna go to the bathroom, and when I get back, we're gonna talk about the Toyota War, which is literally Gaddafi versus the Gunt. I mean, any war where you have Toyotas, you have Chads, and you have like Gaddafi, and you have Gunts, all thrown together, you know is going to be fun. So we'll deal with that when I get back. Okay, let's bring this up. So it's the Toyota War. I'm listening to this as an audiobook. It's just amazing to listen to the this because they keep like saying Chad, they keep saying Gunt out loud. And every time I hear like there's one part where it says crushed under the weight of the gut. I don't know, it's amazing. It's just fucking incredible. Um it's Kino. It might be the most Kino thing in history. Okay, so for those of you who don't know what the Gunt is, so there is a picture. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, you guys might want to evade your eyes because this is kind of disgusting. Okay, so I'm sure most of you probably know who Ethan Ralph is, but this picture surfaced after Knoxville of his stomach leaking out there, and from that we got the term Gunt, which is a cross between cunt and gut, and that became his nickname. And his persona is Ethan Ralph the Gunt. So just let's put that into context. Okay. So Libya had this irredentist claim to northern Chad called the Azu Strip. Now, from my understanding, the Azu Strip was part of Ethiopian. I think Ethan Ralph is like 400. He's like 300 something pounds at 5'1". He weighs, I think, like 100 pounds more than I do, and he's a full foot shorter. So, yeah. So yeah, so this was part of Italian Libya, but it wasn't part of Libya upon it being released at the end of World War II. Um, and apparently it was rich in uranium, but Gaddafi, the supervillain that he was like, I'm going to take this over because I'm going to show Chad that I'm a Chad. Was basically his like thing. And he also wanted to intervene in it because he wanted to impose a Libyan friendly regime in Chad. Um, so let's just go up and take a look at the forces. So I'm not gonna. There is like a number of different. Maybe we'll just read through this because this whole thing was just really like confusing because it went on and on and on and on for like over a decade. Let's see, or for a decade. Okay, so let's go down here. So Libyans occupied the strip during the Chad Civil War. So that was when we had. Is this when we had FAP or is this before? Okay, so there was FAN. Yes, FAP. Okay. The People's Armed Forces. So we have a portion of this called FAP. We have the Vulcan Army. Um, Literally the Vulcan Army. I'm just gonna pretend it's a Star Trek reference, or a reference to the god Vulcan. So we have FAP. We have the Vulcan Army. We have the Gunt. And we have Chads. And just Gaddafi, because Gaddafi's like a supervillain. Gaddafi had like his all-female virgin bodyguard and shit like that. So, okay, so let's see here. So I believe the Christian government got overthrown by the uh, Islamic government, by an Islamic group. Let's see here. Um, So he decided to back the Islam. I think they were the Islamic Legion, was what they were called. So he decided to back the Islamic Legion, which were like Arab. Um, Let me just look this up. Okay, yeah, we'll just take a slight break. Um, yeah, Gaddafi invited Italian models to his palace and gave them copies of the Quran. When he went to France, he on a state visit, he insisted in staying in a tent. So yeah, so he had an all-female cadre of bodyguards. Um, because he believed Arab gunmen would have trouble firing at women. Uh, would keep. I think they had to be virgins. No, maybe that's somewhere else that it did. So yeah, he had his Amazonian bodyguards. When did they did? I'm trying to see if they yeah. So that was just some of the supervillain like uh shit um that he was involved with. Gaddafi is just like it's just fucking amazing. Okay, so where were we again? Where were we again? So the Chad Civil War. So I don't even really know how to explain how the Chad Civil War went because basically there was a bunch of different sides in it that kept switching sides, and Libya kept changing who they were backing. Like initially, the gun was the anti-Libyan force, but then it became the pro-Libyan force, and then it became anti-Libyan again. And it was just such a fucking like. Let me even see here. Where does it say Gunt? Yeah, like you can see here. So the anti-Libyan. So Gunt was initially anti-Libyan, but then it became pro-Libyan, and then it became anti-Libyan again. Um, I don't know. The PLO was randomly involved in this for some reason. Um, Israel was randomly involved with this. So yeah, some of them just kind of switched sides. There was the Islamic Legion. Um, was part of Gaddafi's plan of creating the Great Islamic State of the Sahel. What the fuck? I hadn't even seen this. Let me look at what this meme was. No, that's part of ISIS. Um, I can't even find it. Um, yeah, because Gaddafi was both a Pan Africanist and an Arab and a Pan Arabist. Um, it's really weird. I'm trying to find if there's like it lists anywhere where it references his like dream of creating the. I don't know. It's fucking just bizarre. Um, yeah, the creation of a client state. Um, okay, so he like okay. Just sorry, I'm just trying to like even figure this shit out. Okay, so the one thing I will say in the Libyan army's defense over the course of this war is the French were really tribalish in the way that they dealt with it. So the French intervened on the side of sorry, not the side of the Israelis, the side of the Chads, And the French sent in fighter bombers, and the Libyans were scared to shoot them down because that would trigger a war with France. So France was literally, it was a cries out in pain as he strikes you situation. So France would just blow up Libyan shit, and the Libyans couldn't fire back because they were afraid that if they shot down a French plane, then France would intervene more because it would be interpreted as an aggressive action. And that was kind of one of this thing happened. Another kind of issue that was that during this war, Gaddafi survived. I think it was like 4 or 5 different military coups. So you had the situation where divisions no longer existed within the Libyan army. It was just battalions, and that obviously didn't really work. I don't know. So let's see here. Let me just see. So there's a couple different phases of the war. Um, Basically, Libya won a couple times during the early war because the people they were fighting against literally had no anti-tank weapons. So even though the Libyans were completely retarded, the fact that they had tanks and the Chads didn't have any anti-tank weapons meant there really wasn't anything that they could do um, at the time. So let's see here. Um, but I forget. Let me just see if they have like a list because I can't really keep the whole thing straight because the whole thing is just it took like it just went on forever and the whole thing was just such a fucking mess. Okay, so um, that was this one. So let's see here. Libyan victory. I think this was when Libya was fighting the Chads, and let's see here. So this was helping. Um, I'm sorry. This is fucking great content. But yeah, generally speaking, the Libyan forces were just extremely passive. Like, they wouldn't counterattack. They wouldn't even normally shoot when fired upon. Their aircraft couldn't hit anything. Their artillery couldn't hit anything. It was just a complete and utter fucking disaster. Um, One of the things that the Libyans did. So I think by this point in the war in the mid 80s, the Libyans had managed to hold the northern half of the country, and the current government held the south. So this is what the gun was holding at this point in time, because the gut I think was temporarily the national government, but then it got overthrown by Fan and FAP, and then Fan and FAP kicked the Libyan kicked the gun out, and then the gun allied with the Libyans, and they controlled like the northern half of Chad. So the French were offered ordered I think offered like a mutual withdrawal of their forces from Chad if the Libyans would do the same. And Libya agreed to it and then just didn't withdraw their forces. Um, and used that as an opportunity to try to fire, excuse me, to do their own counteroffensive. Let's see here. Yeah, so okay, let's see here. The following year, the French withdrawal was one of the quietest since the ascent of power of Habre with both forces, even if the Gun had initially expressed desire. Let's see here. The Gun was increasingly isolated internationally and disintegrating internally in reaction to the decline of his client. Okay, so then there was Fant and Fap. Okay. So we had a couple different things. I think this was. Let's see here. There was the Tibesti War, which the Libyans got their asses kicked. Anyways, let's get to the fucking Toyota War. Um, let's get to the Toyota War. So this was the final phase of the Libyan Chad War. So after okay, so sorry, just go back. I'm sorry if this is fucking confusing. This is great content. So the French and Libyans had made the agreement to withdraw from Chad at the same time, and Libya signed it, but then didn't withdraw, and that really pissed France off. So France went Habre and the Chads, and they're like, "Look, Chads, what do you need to win this war? We'll give you tanks, we'll give you artillery, we'll give you aircraft. Just name what you need." And Habre was like, "Look, dudes, we don't have the like IQ or the capacity to use tanks or to use any of this shit. Just give us machine guns, anti-armor rifles, and just give us some fucking Toyotas with crew-served weapons on the back." And they were just like, "Are you sure you don't want tanks and aircraft? It's like you're going to be disadvantaged against the Libyans." He's just like, "Look, dude, we don't have the IQ to use these things. We're just going to do what we know how to do, which is just to do desert warfare the way our ancestors did. But we're going to do it with with fucking pickup trucks and recoilless rifles." And they're like, "We're such chads that we don't need." Let me just see here. We don't need like tanks or aircraft or any of that shit. We just need Toyota pickup trucks with guns on them. So here's some images from the Toyota War. So we have the I'm not sure if that's an AA gun. We have a heavy machine gun. We have rocket launchers on the back. We have the Toyotas with the recoilless rifles. Um, we have a bunch of Chads riding on that. Uh, I think they also got some armored cars. We have yeah, there we go, a recoilless rifle on the back of the. Yeah, Toyota trucks are really resistant to damage. So so what wound up happening is the Chads just went Chad on them, and the Chads just used the Chads just used traditional African tactics. So the Libyans refused to do reconnaissance. So the Libyans had like drones. I think they might have had drones, but they had aircraft and all this mechanized warfare. But the commanders were lazy, so they refused to do recon. The Chads actually did stuff like recon. They like would probe the Libyan lines to figure out where the Libyan lines were weak and then attack there. They would also use swarm tactics where they would attack from multiple directions at the same time. And some of the battles you had near the end of the war where would literally be the Libyans would lose 10 times the number as the Chads would. And there was battles where they'd lose like 3 Toyotas versus like 70 or 80 tanks for the Libyans because the Libyans were just incapable of using any of their shit. They couldn't use their aircraft. They couldn't use their artillery. The Chads didn't even have artillery. They had like mortars and shit like that. Um, Also, the main thing France did after that was France provided maintenance because the Chads weren't able to maintain like their trucks. Um, that was beyond their capability. It was too hard. Let's just take a look at a couple of these. They also had like strategic things, like where um, they would go past Libyan fortified positions and cut off their supply route. And the Libyans didn't really know how to deal with that. There was like a case where the Chads attacked at night. Even though the Libyans had gotten night training from the Soviet Union, they just kind of ran around and fired in random directions and got their asses kicked. Let's see here. Battle of Fadwa. Okay, so like here's an example. This is probably the best example. Battle of Fadwa. Okay, so we had 1,200 Libyans versus 3,000 Chads, and the Chads lost 18 people died, 3 trucks were destroyed. The Libyans lost 90, over 100 tanks. And like another 50 armored vehicles. Like, how do you fuck up that bad? I think that was a fortified position too. Um, I think they were attacking a like fortified position or something like that. Yeah, I think the Libyans had like dug in massively, but they were just that retarded. Like they weren't able to do anything. Um okay, so that was one of the turning points. Then we have the Battle of Bir Kora, which was the next one in the war, where it was an unknown number of. There's just so few they don't even know. The Libyans lost 90 tanks versus several trucks. Like, how could you suck that bad? And I get it that it's kind of hard to deal with fast moving trucks, and it's not so much the Chads, like they had modern anti-tank equipment, but still, like, you'd think even if the tanks fired back, they would have done better than this. um yeah, so what happened during this battle, which was kind of interesting, um is so the Libyans were under attack and they sent a relief force. The relief force was like 3 days too late, but they decided not to call off the relief force. So the Chadians overran the Libyan relief force as well. Let's see here. Battle of Azu. Think this was another disaster. So they lost this one as well. It doesn't say what the Chad casualties were. Pyrrhic Libyan victory. Imagine getting a Pyrrhic Libyan victory where it's 400 versus 15,000, and you suck that hard that you still lose. Okay, Toyota trucks. So they put anti tank missiles on Toyota pickup trucks and raced 2 of the trucks towards the tank from opposite directions. The tanks weren't able to move their turrets fast enough to track them. Um, so yeah, the Chads were just very dynamic, fast moving forces. They basically just fought like how they traditionally had, but with other stuff. Let's see, another Chad victory. Oh, this one's another. Is this the last one? Oh yeah, this is when Chad invaded Libya. Um, Chad invaded Libya because they sucked that much to destroy their various supply dumps. So once again, this is like the Libyans lost pretty much their entire army. Um, the remainder of their tanks and aircraft. Let me see if there's like a total losses for the war. Okay, yeah, the Libyans lost 800 tanks over the course of the war, um, and a lot of their air force, and it was just a fucking disaster. I mean, you lose to the Gunt and you lose to the FAP. Um, like, is there anything more pathetic than losing to an organization called FAP or losing to the Gunt? Like, it's a meme war. Like, you got the Chads being Chad, you got the Gunt being slow and inept. You have Gaddafi just completely screwing the pooch on it. It's just amazing. Let's see here. Yeah, they blew up the main Libyan airbase in southern Libya. Uh, let's see here. Um, a general offensive into Libya proper. Can you imagine if Chad had have overwhelmed Libya and put the Gunt in power, and then Libya would have been run by the Gunt? Like, it's just it's just so shitty. Like, I can't even believe it, to be honest. Yeah, the Chads also used armored vehicles, armored cars, which are pretty useful. I think they have enough armor to block small arms fire. Let me see. Kind of. What is their armor? Um, it doesn't say what they're capable of. I'm just wondering if they can stop like 50 BMG. I don't know. Anyways, so that's the Toyota War. That's Gunt versus Chad with Gaddafi thrown in and FAP thrown in as well. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. Libya lost to Chad. They couldn't even hold this fucking tiny strip in the middle of nowhere. So, I hope people enjoyed this show. Um, I might do another video on this, but I thought that just covered most of the stuff that I wanted to cover. So,